Hello and welcome to the Michael Mama Show. I'm your host, Michael Mamas, and we're coming to you from Mount Soma, home of the Sri Someshwara Temple in the mountains of Western North Carolina. Beautiful spring day here, just gorgeous. Okay, today's podcast is a good one. It's interesting, and I think it's something for some cultures, I think more so than others, but it's an important one. And just before we get into it, I don't know if you noticed this, Scotty, in the notes or not, but next week we're going to start a series on the tanmatras, the five divine currents we call them,
Yeah.
and that's a popular request. A lot of people have heard about them, or even some of the students that have gone through the whole series want to do it again. It's a very valuable thing, and it's how the five tanmatras well up through the personality, you could say. And what our relationship with that is. And so it's a very, very powerful tool for our own inner psychodynamic exploration, and also our insights into other people and what makes them tick. All right. So I got a note, an email from a long-term student, and it was beautiful, and so I actually got their permission and I posted it. So if you go to michaelmamas.net and look at this blog post for this podcast, you can read it. I'd encourage you to do it. It's a beautiful thing, and also I think my comments to it, what I wrote about it, would be valuable to take a look at. So I encourage you to do that. And, if you're interested, for some reason, when we switched from blogs, just doing blogs, to podcasts, all of a sudden we started getting no comments in writing. And so all the comments and all the inputs I'm getting are from word of mouth, or they write the school office and it gets forwarded to me or something. But people aren't posting them. I don't know why. But, I encourage you to do that because it makes a lively interaction. And I always thought it was a really nice part of the blogs that we were doing. Okay, so this podcast is about something that she coined the phrase inner grit. And from reading what she wrote, I could tell that it was real genuine movement in the direction of real spiritual growth. I think a lot of times when people hear the phrase inner grit, I mean, what kind of connotations that bring on, which I don't think is what she meant, but might bring on connotations of like being tough, claiming your truth, which usually in cases like that is people claiming their issues and their wounds as their truth, And so inner grit can take on, and we don't know it, because a lot of this comes from the subconscious. And as I've said in previous podcasts, the subconscious kind of determines what we think in the conscious mind. It's our conditioning. And so when we think of our own inner strength, our own inner grit, our own, even our own spiritual integrity, our own connection with the divine and how it wells up through our individuality, oftentimes what we think that is not that. A lot of times we just, get involved in behavioral modification, well, if I behave this way, if I act this way, if I speak this way, then, that shows that I'm spiritually advanced, and that's all just behavioral modification. It's manipulation, I know Swami Muktananda, at least it's attributed to him. He said, if you don't like your personality, you better change it now, because after you're enlightened, you won't care. And, there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, if you get his point, there's a lot of truth to that. He was really speaking to, it's not about behavioral modification. And you have your personality. We all have our own personalities. And that that doesn't change all that much as we evolve. I remember I used to reference this guy who was in the monastery, the ashram, when I was there. And in the early years, he was just kind of angry and grumpy and negative, and nobody really wanted to be around him. But as the years progressed, it was interesting because his personality hadn't changed. He still kind of had that sort of crotchety sort of attitude, but somehow there was something where there was a charm to it, if that can make sense. And he was fun to be around, and we can't attain that sort of manipulation, that sort of refinement of our personality by imposing, what we think will be like when we're enlightened, or what we think enlightened people were like. But you see, spiritual growth, real spiritual growth, there are phase transitions that, just boom and a big shift. But generally speaking, it's, you're crossing a desert, it's a long, slow process. It's, you do your meditations and you go through life, you do your meditation, you go through life, and gradually over time, you evolving. And that's why they say evolve. Evolution is a process, and it takes time. It's not an instant boom, except for those moments that there are moments of phase transition. For example, that moment of enlightenment, which I've talked about in previous podcasts. So having said that, there's also a distinction to be made here between a cultured life and behavioral modification. I've been around, as I've talked about this in the past, I've been around people who just grew up in an environment. I'm thinking of a particular couple I know that was from South India, and they lived in a small village, I guess, and just the culture there, the tradition there was so fine, and it created a very fine level of life spontaneously in these people's personality. And it wasn't because they tried to pound their physiology into functioning a certain way, their psychology into functioning a certain way, so much as if it's just was inherent in their nature by virtue of their life, And so that's a cultured life, and as opposed to, trying to modify your behavior to align with what you think you'll be like when you're enlightened, But a cultured life, it's like I've spoken about this in previous podcasts. We have the divinity within, and from there wells up our own true nature, whatever that is. We're all unique. And then it interfaces with our physiology, our psychology, our being on a more superficial level, which, we've referred to as a house of mud. So even when you're enlightened, you're still living in that physiology with that physiology and psychology's karma, which is a house of mud. And so there's a long process. Some would even say it's even more challenging part where all that aligns with your own true divine nature, so that your functioning, it ceases to be a house of mud. It becomes a house of crystal, a house of glass, and that's we're talking now about the immortals, we're talking about the Saptarishis, very, very rare thing. Maybe some saints living in caves or what have you in the Himalayas, but by and large, an individual that's enlightened is still functioning in a house of mud. And so culturing that, refining that, it's not something you do from the outside. Oh, I'm supposed to think this way or be that way. Not at that stage. It's more about just the natural blossoming, the natural infusion of our own inner divinity into all the different aspects of our psyche. It's a refinement and a purification on all levels of our being, you know. Everything refines. Just tangentially, it's just an interesting thing is it refines the point where even the tissues of the body refine. It's like they transcend. And so it gets to the point where there's a thing called an absolute body, where it looks the same, the physiology, I mean, fingers, toes, the whole thing, and the appearance, all appearances, it's the same, but the reality is they're not really there. We're talking about, Lord Krishna or people like that. We're not talking about even your more recognized saints, But it is interesting, that they're not really there. It's the absolute interfacing with relativity. That's tangential, but I think it's a beautiful point, So your spiritual growth then, your level of spiritual development really is not that much a function of your outward appearance, how you come across to people. It's not even all that much a function of your own inner dynamic. If you're still functioning in a house of mud, all that continues. It doesn't just stop and go away the instant you become enlightened even. But there's this very interesting and beautiful process when that inner grit, that inner divinity starts, the physiology, the awareness, it starts to, you start to become more and more awake to it. Now, everybody to some degree is awake to it. And that's the source of religion, really. The reason people are religious is because they have some sense of that inner divinity, and they call it different names. They call it Jesus, or they call it the Christ, or they call it, Muhammad, Buddha, or whatever, and so there's some sense of it. But as you grow spiritually, what starts happening is that sense, that awareness of it grows stronger and stronger. And so that's now interfacing with this level of house of mud confusion and all like that, conditioning, preconceived notions, all of that shit. And it even creates confusion. It's like, what's happening to me? It's disconcerting, actually. So, it's a little bit like, it's a birthing process, and I think that this, I could just tell by reading it and the feeling of what she wrote here. It's quite beautiful, and it describes her experience of that process as she's awakening more and more to the transcendental depth of our being, to whatever degree, but nevertheless, you see, that's another thing, is it's like 2 points determine a line. And so many people are on spiritual paths, and I mean, I hate to say it, but they don't work. It's just behavioral modification, emotional indulgence, or going to some left-handed tantra guy who rips open your third eye and all of a sudden light starts flooding in. You think you're enlightened. All sorts of things like that. But when you're on a path that's creating this true evolution, that's why I teach the meditation that I do, because it's real. And again, you can access it for free. Michael Mamas, just type it into YouTube and it'll come up, But what happens then is you go, now, if you haven't done that and you're just doing behavioral modification, for example, you're just kind of spinning around the same point that you're at. There's no real progress there. But if you're genuinely evolving, then you move from that point to this point, and it's like 2 points determine a line. And so you get an idea of the direction true spiritual growth moves in. It's not a clear-cut thing, but it's a sense of it. So now you have a real sense of what spiritual evolution is about. And that's what she's speaking of here. She's starting to sense it, and there's confusion but nevertheless, you can feel it, and she can feel it in the depth of her being. It's real. And so all that's going on, and it's absolutely beautiful, at least to me when I read it. It's like, this is really nice, you know. That's basically, I just would encourage you to all go to michaelmamas.net and read it. It's beautiful. And that's really all I have this week, Scotty, unless you had some questions or something to add.
No, that's good. Yeah.
All right. Very good. Thanks, everybody, for listening. It means a lot to me that I know a number of you are, being regular with monitoring these podcasts. And I appreciate it very much. And I'm also toying around with the idea of doing classes again, but I'm not sure what form that would take these days. All right. Well, thank you so much, and we'll talk with you again next week.